Hi everyone, Jonathan here with two pretty similar pistols. And I'm going to admit right out of the gate, this thing, what's usually called the Webley Jurek, doesn't really have a defined name for reasons that will become apparent. The Webley Jurek pistol is in fact the British version of the German Walther P38, the famous or even infamous P38 pistol, designed to replace the Luger. It's cheaper, easier, quicker to make, and essentially just as good or even better than the Luger. So I think most of us know the P38 to one extent or another, and you can see it's not just the visual similarity. I'm always arguing about things like the Sturmgewehr AK situation, that in fact they're not, one is not a copy of the other, but in this case, well, still not a copy, but very, very clearly inspired by. Someone saw this, liked it, wanted to do their own take on it. So the name Jurek, Marion Karol Jurek, was a Polish national. He was born in 1904 in what is now Poland, was then Galicia. Lots of borders changed at the end of the First World War. We'll leave it at that. He produced his first pistol design in 1919, apparently, as quite a young man, which is quite interesting in itself. He became a competition shooter before the war. As you might imagine, he joined up with the Polish military with the outbreak of war when the Nazis invaded, or just before that, I think. Prior to that, he'd done his PhD, had a doctorate, and he went to become head of R&D at an ammunition plant in Warsaw, I believe it was. So this was before the outbreak of war. With the outbreak of war, he joined the Polish army. The Polish army, of course, and Polish military full stop, had to decamp to the UK primarily, as it was their headquarters. And so he was a Polish soldier for quite some time. He was seconded to the British Army in order that he could, in peace I suppose, design a submachine gun, a machine carbine as we call them back in the day, for potential adoption by the British forces. He actually did deploy to Europe with the 1st Armoured Division, I think it was. After the war, he was demobilised in 1949, so he stayed in the armed forces for a few years. He then stayed in the UK, ended up in Birmingham, and he joined the firm of Webley and Scott. And that's where the Webley part of the Webley Jurek comes in. Quite a fascinating story, even before we get back to the gun. So I mentioned that this is usually called the Webley Jurek. You will see it described as the Webley high-power pistol in some literature and online. And if we jump straight to this inscription on the slide, you'll see that the words high power are on there, beautifully engraved, much like an old handmade Webley revolver or something. But it doesn't say high power pistol. The full inscription is Webley and Scott Limited, Birmingham. Obviously that's the company, and that's on both sides. And then very, very finely below that, we have 9mm high-power CTG, being an abbreviation for cartridge automatic pistol. So 9mm high-power automatic pistol. Sorry, 9mm high-power cartridge automatic pistol. And for me, that cartridge in the middle of the designation says it's not really the name of the pistol in the same way that the Browning high-power is the name of the pistol. Although, having said that, cartridge and ammunition and weapon go together as a system. So you can call it the Webley high power if you like. I'm going to continue to call it the Webley Jurek. So what do they mean by 9mm high power? Well, it's not the high power cartridge that's used by competition shooters today. That's an even hotter load of 9mm parabellum. This is in fact in the same 9mm parabellum or 9mm Luger cartridge as the P38. By high power, they're referring to the British 9mm Mark IIZ load of the 9mm, which in 1944 was beefed up to deliver 1,300 feet per second muzzle velocity. So relatively beefy for 9mm. And that was because they needed it to reliably run Sten guns, primarily. So it's a submachine gun load, but then of course what you do is you design your pistols going forward to run that pokier cartridge, and you standardize on one cartridge. But for a brief period of time, you had the Mark 1, and even the Mark 1Z, I think, was not sufficiently powerful to reliably run Sten guns because of the blowback action. But then by the time you got Mark 2Z and then upped to its maximum potential in 1944, that's now running everything. So submachine guns, pistols, anything you care to put a 9mm cartridge in. So much for the ammunition. Let's have a look at the pistol itself. And lots of points of comparison with the P38. So general form factor, if you want to use the IT or engineering expression, it's the same basic length. Now there was a Mark 1 or a serial number 1. This is serial number 2, only 2 ever made. So serial number 1 had a significantly longer barrel and more of a sort of beaver tail overhang here, making the whole thing significantly longer and making it look a bit less like a P38. But quite quickly, and this is 1953, so the Jurek first penned the design in 1952, made a working model in mild steel, but it wasn't until 53 that serial number 1 and then serial number 2 were produced. And we don't quite know when in 53 those two versions were produced. But that was the main change. No other substantial changes, no mechanical changes that I'm aware of. They just made it more compact. And as you can see, it does sit rather nicely in the hand, quite overhanging the knuckle here quite well. Quite a short barrel, but enough barrel to do the job. You might not necessarily get, you might well get the 1300 feet per second. I don't know. We'd have to test it, and we're not going to shoot this one. Only 2 exist. Both of them do survive. But so what else? Well, the barrel protruding out the front. You've got a slide here that is truncated as a result of that. So we have both the point of comparison and the point of departure, as it were, in that the slide is the same length, give or take a millimetre, same width, same basic shape. It's just that it doesn't have milled out this big open ejection port that the P38 is known for on top. Advantage there is you get a great big open ejection area, so reliability in theory does increase. Downside, though, is that it could let in dirt and foreign bodies and things and potentially jam up the gun. So a little bit of a reliability trade-off there. Modern pistols tend not to have that sort of open slide, with the notable exception of the Beretta series. Very similar, at least at first glance, on the Jurek. It's the same lever, works the same way, except it doesn't quite. So this is also, it's a similarity, but it's also a difference. I'll try and explain why. So without the safety applied, it will cock and fire. Double action mode, and you can do the same single action mode. With the lever in the down position, and actually both weapons have their own form of S and F to show you when it's on safe and when it's on fire. That's so far so normal. So with the safety in the down position, we can't pull through on the trigger. You can see the hammer's trying to come back to fire the gun, but it can't. And likewise, as you might imagine, because they're connected, if I try to cock it for single action operation, i.e. cocking it for the first shot manually, I can't do that either. So the safety works to that extent. However, there's a fairly major design flaw, at least in my book, where if we cock the pistol, put the lever down, not only is it not a decocker, okay, that's a decision you can make. There are certain Beretta variants, for example, where it doesn't decock if you apply the safety. Fine, although it might confuse people who've used the P38. More worryingly, though, you can still shoot it. We also have a magazine safety. That was, I think we already had a British military requirement for a service pistol for general adoption, self-loading pistol, that it must have a magazine safety so that when the magazine comes out, and those of you who use the Browning high power, the L9A1 in British service, will know that it's one of the high power variants that does retain a magazine safety. So I'm pretty sure the military wanted that. It was becoming a thing. So with the magazine out, it blocks the whole thing. You can't cock it. In fact, the hammer can't move at all in this condition, so you can't pull the trigger to fire it, you can't cock it to fire it, regardless of where the manual safety is. So 2 safety mechanisms, one of which is a little bit lacking compared to the P38, well, lacking in 2 respects. One, that it doesn't stop you shooting it, and 2, it's not a decocker. And then in here, up inside the grip here, the magazine well, is a little lever that is depressed by the magazine being in, and it activates the trigger mechanism. That's it for safety mechanisms. So otherwise, we have in fact duplicated the other 2 controls on the P38, being the slide release and the disassembly lever. You'll see both of those. Let's look in a moment, but first of all, just the slide release. So we have to have the magazine in to be able to lock it open. We could then remove the source of feed, which is what we prefer to do when we're clearing firearms. And the slide is now held open on the slide release, and we can, or slide lock, slide release, whatever you want to call that, and you can activate it as normal. So it works as normal, except the magazine disconnect gets in the way. Right, I do want to take this apart to show you the significant differences. Before we do that, so there's a housing on the top here. It's quite flush, it's quite hard to see, but you can see there's a different insert in the slide. It's much easier to see on the P38 because, again, this is a lift from the Walther design. That's a piece of sheet metal that covers, well, most notably, a tiny little pin, which hopefully you can see, below the rear sight, which is the loaded cartridge indicator. So that is taken straight from the P38 as well. When there's a round in the chamber, this pin at the front is pushed back and it protrudes out the back, and you can see that you have a cartridge in the chamber, and you can feel that you have a cartridge in the chamber, which is important for night time, basically. So before we take this thing apart and show you where it really diverts from the inspiration, just take a look at that grip. I'm sure you've already been looking at that and scratching your head. It's incredibly narrow at this point. Really nice. Apart from how beautifully made and finished this is, it's the selling point, frankly, is that that's an incredibly ergonomic grip, at least for my hands. Fits perfectly, it points well, and it's largely to do with, well, partly the shaping of the walnut grip panels. We've got a textured backstrap here as well, but mainly it's that they've reduced that distance between the front strap and the rear strap to the absolute minimum possible to fit a 9mm magazine. How have they done that? Well, most pistols have a mainspring in the back of the grip. It's really the only place to put it on almost all pistol designs, is to have it back here, and that bulks the whole thing out significantly. So it's not, obviously the magazine is only that small, you can make the grip that small, but if you then have to have a vertical V-spring or sometimes a coil spring housed in the back strap, that's what makes a self-loading pistol grip bigger than a revolver. Well, Webley and Jurek were able to make essentially a revolver size and shape grip on a self-loading pistol by getting rid of that spring. You can't get rid of that spring. They had to move it somewhere, and they moved it into the hammer assembly. So it's in there, really tightly wound, and that unfortunately contributes to an extremely heavy trigger pull. I had to check this for myself because I didn't believe the trial reports. Jumping ahead slightly to the trial report, 32 pounds pull off. Pull off is the phrase we use in British English, but the trigger weight. 32 pounds. So obviously not for single action. For single action, i.e. you just pull the trigger with the hammer cocked for the first shot, it's about 5 pounds. It's a decent trigger. For double action, it is, and I'm going to have to hold this properly to do this, it stacks massively toward the back of the trigger guard. So I'm holding it there, and it's, good grief, that's a lot of trigger pressure. Pull it all the way through. It's perfectly doable, but it's extremely heavy. You're going to be wobbling like anything. That first shot is just going to go wild, frankly, I think, unless you've really practiced with it and you've really exercised your fingers. That's a 32-pound pull-off. That's astonishingly heavy. That's about twice as heavy as, I mean, it's a Brown Bess trigger, which has to be heavy to let the flint scrape enough burning steel off the frizzen to work, is only about 20 pounds maximum, something like that. 32 pounds is just insane. And the geometry of this does not lend itself well to overcoming that either. You're not getting the mechanical advantage of a lever. Well, you are, but not. It's a very short lever because you're having to pull it up here. It's awful. Sorry, Jurek and Webley. Beautiful historic firearm, but that trigger pull, you would have to develop a habit of cocking it for single action operation, and it would be fine. So there are ways to train around things like that. The trial feedback actually included a mention of, please put the spring in the grip or somehow reduce the heavy trigger pull because it's not fit for service. Getting ahead of myself slightly, but I think it's an important point to make. So I've talked about how similar this is. We've got a couple of points of departure already. The main differences are internal, so let's show you the inside of this thing. Now, the best way to do this is to actually cock the pistol, because you can't do that without the magazine in, then take the magazine out. Then we can operate our disassembly lever here, which is very, very big, bigger than the P38 one. Might be accidentally operable. Rotate that forwards, and that lets us slide the slide and the barrel off the front of the gun. Before we look at the interesting bits, now this area of the frame is different because it's housing a different hammer assembly, a slightly different trigger, well, somewhat different trigger mechanism, and the mainspring, as mentioned. But otherwise, this is very P38-y. In fact, these cutouts in the slide, these cutouts in the frame that include the slide rails are identical, almost identical. They're not interchangeable, but they're identical, if that makes sense. So we have these two main slide springs, recoil springs, dual, one on each side, and that is a straight lift, again, from the P38. Earlier Webleys did have similar dual recoil springs, but this design of recoil spring with and rod is just the P38. There's no getting around that. Incidentally, minor things like the extractor and ejector being on the other side of the gun, that's true too. That's a function of changing the ejection arrangement with the ejection port. They wanted a conventional ejection port. So this is perhaps less interesting, except that, and you'll forgive my non-scientific tool here, but it's actually the best way to do it. The grips, this was sort of a selling point. There are no screws on this design. It's all controls that are operable by the fingers or by a handy tool like this plastic pen. And then we can pop off the grip panel, and you can see how I did that. That's just a little pivoting plate. Push down on that, and off pops your grip panel, and then you can much more easily do the same on the other side. So both the grips come off, and we can see there. So P38 aficionados, in case you were wondering, this is the difference in the lock work. We won't get into all the engagement surfaces and how that works. So that's the right-hand side. You can see there's still a trigger bar on the right-hand side. It's more concealed than on the P38, but it's there. The exact arrangement of sears and vents and things is different. And then on the other side, just to try and get you a good look, it's different again. So, incidentally, for those of a technical mindset, that is your disconnector there that's sliding up and down. So, differences in the trigger mechanism to the P38 as well, but the thing I keep going on about is the locking, or keep alluding to, is the locking system. So what this is a P38 with a Browning locking system. So the barrel, the slide has the classic, think of the 1911 for example, parallel slots cut into the inside surface of it. The same on the Browning high power, funnily enough, it's going to become very important at the end of this story. And the corresponding surfaces there on the barrel, again, just like the 90, just like all the Browning, nearly all the Browning pistols. And then this is also a Browning feature. It's just executed differently. So we have two swinging links attaching the barrel to an additional component, this sort of cradle or chassis, whatever you want to call it. Now that's not a feature of a Browning pistol, but the swinging links, including two links in certain early Browning Colt pistols, is taken from Browning. So Browning locking system, Walther P38 design, that's your major difference. So you're probably wondering why, the P38, pretty good design, lasted quite a long time. The variants of it were in service with Germany well after the Nazi period that it was invented in. Elements of it carried over to the Beretta 92. It's a good, solid design. Why would you change such a major aspect of it? Well, the Browning system, the lugs and the two swinging links that became one link after the model 1905, they're all very good features. Preference, I suppose. If I had to guess, and it's not written anywhere, it's probably to do with that worry over such an open slide causing problems getting mud in there or something. But that's pure speculation. We don't know. All we know is that Jurek preferred the Browning system in what he was otherwise clearly happy with, the P38 design. So I've referred to the British military trial that took place with the Jurek pistol. That was, I should say up front, before I give you more details from it, this was not a case of we are having a competitive pistol trial to adopt the next pistol for the British military. It was a case of, much like some of the other things we've covered on this series, this might be worth looking at. Let's just see if it's any good. And so they tested it against the existing Enfield No. 2 revolver, as you might imagine, the 38 caliber revolver, and also the Browning High Power, because of course the Browning High Power was already in British military service. The Parachute Regiment notably had received a number of them made in Canada. So we already had a very good modern self-loading pistol, 13 rounds capacity, as opposed to 8 for both of these. I think pretty much everyone involved must have known where this was going to go. But nonetheless, they wanted to do a bit of a sense check, I suppose, and perhaps throw a bone to Webley, be courteous and give them the opportunity to show them their latest product. So they did. So that trial took place July 1953. This was done at the testing section at Enfield, the Royal Small Arms Factory. The accuracy I've mentioned, no significant difference in accuracy at all. The Webley had one stoppage in the elevation depression test, where you shoot it at 80 degrees vertical and 80 degrees depression, elevation, 80 degrees elevation, 80 degrees depression. And in the 80 degrees depression, that's probably not 80 degrees, it had one stoppage, which was one more than the other two pistols. Now, you wouldn't expect a revolver to have any difference there anyway, but they wanted to test that against the high power. It ran flawlessly. The Webley had a stoppage. Is that significant? You wouldn't know unless you ran a proper trial, but it's not a good sign, is it? So, we also had problems with the sand and the mud tests. They actually did sand and mud tests with these things. Presumably not this one, because it's in pretty good condition. But then, as far as we know, they only made 2. So, hey, maybe I need to look microscopically to see if there's any damage from sand grains or something. In theory, this would be the pistol they used. Nonetheless, the Webley did worse in the sand and mud tests as well. Again, not enough data to say for sure whether it was any good, but the Browning High Power had one stoppage to do with the magazine spring, which isn't the weapon, it's just part of the magazine. This thing had multiple stoppages with both sand and mud, so unfortunately they weren't onto a winner there either. I've mentioned the very heavy trigger pull that came in for criticism. Also, the number of components. So we had 79 components in this design, compared to only 50 for the Browning High Power and 59 for the Walther. And they bring in the Walther at this point. They don't trial it against the Walther, but they mention that they're clearly aware that it's a revised form of Walther P38, because they say, well, this thing only has 59 parts, and sorry, 55 parts. So why does this thing have 79? It needs to be simplified. The trigger pull needs to be reduced before we even would consider it. And of course, by 1953, they're well on the way to looking at proper competitive proper trials to sort of solidify what's already the case, which is that we have the Browning high power, the P35, the HP35, GP35, the Grand Puissance, whatever you want to call it. We know it's good. We know it works. It's fought part of a war. So, long story short, this thing falls to the curb, and it's the Browning high power that's adopted as the L9A1, not just for specialist units like the Paras, but for everybody. Although not until the 1960s. It's adopted, I believe, in the late 50s. I'd have to check. But it doesn't fully replace the Enfield/Webley 38 until the 1960s. But then it serves until 2013 with distinction, excellent service pistol, and this was a nice try from Webley, but sadly it wasn't going to cut the mustard. And you can call this the last Webley, because although the Webley company was not by any means torpedoed by this lack of military contract, on their handgun side of things, it was pretty much a nail in the coffin. Their revolvers had been sort of passed over effectively. Revolvers were falling out of favour. Britain was one of the last major nations to replace its revolvers with self-loading pistols. So in that respect, this is the last Webley. It's the last Webley handgun, because there were no new Webley revolver designs, and there were no more Webley attempts at a self-loading pistol. I have some exciting news for you. In March, we're going to be running an historic firearms event, which is great in itself. You'll be able to show up for free and see some extra exciting things, as well as the displays of firearms that we have in the galleries. But on the 11th of March, I'm going to be available for a live episode of What Is This Weapon that you can come and see. And we'll also have a bit of a Q&A option later in the day as well. So both of those are ticketed. They're going to be different sort of tiers of tickets that you can purchase. We have the link down in the description, but you can also check out the website or social media. You shouldn't be able to miss it. So that you can come and see me and watch me do my thing, and perhaps even come and say hello and have a bit of a chat as well. So very much looking forward to that event and to that day in particular. Hope to see you there.